This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University and co-author of a new book entitled Zionism in Arab Discourses that was recently published in English by Manchester University Press. The book explores how Israel and its founding ideology have been perceived by Arab intellectuals belonging to two streams in particular, Islamists and liberals. Professor Uriya Shavit, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, great to be here.
So in the West, Israel is often used as a tool in the public discourse. So when the country is evoked, it's not really to talk about Israel, but it allows people to talk about themselves. Is it also the case in the Arab world?
Absolutely so. I mean, the interesting thing is when you read Arab Discourses on Zionism, it really tells you very little about Israel, but tells you a lot about the way Arabs think, or specific Arab thinkers conceptualize the futures of their states. When you read Islamist texts about Israel, trying to conceptualize, to understand why Israel was successful, they pretty much say that Israel was successful, and still is, at least in comparison to its Arab neighbors, because it is really an Islamic state. A Jewish Islamic state, but nevertheless Islamic. When you read Arab liberals, they say Israel is so successful because it is a liberal state. Therefore, Arabs should become liberal.
Okay, before we get to that, because it raises many questions. So, drawing on the beginning of your answer, do they really understand Israel?
Well, that depends how you define really understand, because Israel is a very complex phenomenon, and people understand it differently also in Israel itself. I think they know more than what most Israelis would assume. I'm talking about not just 21st century Israel, also 19th century Zionist movement. Mm-hmm. I think Arabs knew about it perhaps more than what most Israelis and observers would imagine. So
they identified it as a phenomenon in the Middle East from a very early stage?
From the very earliest stage, when the Zionist movement just starts to evolve. And I'm surprised sometimes you read texts from, let's say, the 80s. Before there is internet, before there is satellite television, knowledge about very petty Israeli political affairs and debates and
domestic
so forth.
Issues.
The very domestic issues. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, there is knowledge, profound knowledge. And I would even say the following, that the average Islamist scholar knows more about Israel than the average Jewish religious scholar who's in Israel, what he knows about or she knows about Arab affairs. However, there's a purpose for the writing, and it has nothing to do with understanding Israel in the, let's say, academic objective sense. Mm-hmm. They really try to analyze Israeli society in a way that supports their own ambitions and objectives for Arab society. Mm-hmm. Even more than that, it's understanding Israel in order to understand what we need to do better. That is the official slogan. But
know your enemy as well.
Know your enemy. But somehow they always manage to understand Israel in a way that supports their arguments. I'll give you an example. For Islam, it's of course very useful for the Israeli success story and for the Israeli triumphs in the Arab-Israeli wars. It's very useful to believe that Israel won because it's religious, because of devotion, because Israelis fought in the name of their Lord, which is, by the way, also the Lord of the Art.
What you mean by saying that they see Israel as a purely Islamist state? As
a purely religious state, or as a predominantly religious state. And therefore you will never, at least we, in researching for the book, we found no single evidence for an Islamist who writes about the kibbutz movement, or about the socialist origins of Zionism, or of practical Zionism. And that's, of course, curious, because anyone who knows Zionist history knows how interrelated and connected it was with socialism and with the kibbutz movement. But when you read liberals, when you read Arab liberal literature, Israel is a very secular state. A very scientific state, by the way, as well. And of course, Israel is not just that, especially not since 1967. And of course, Zionism is not devoid of a religious component. So what I'm saying is, I think if someone would really engage in writing a serious book about Zionism or a serious analysis of Zionism, he or she would show Zionism for all that it is, which is secular and religious, scientific and irrational. But when you read Arab texts, they are usually one or the other, and that has a lot to do with who's the writer and what are the agendas that the writer is trying to promote.
I would assume that Arabs would see Israel as, especially the Islamists, as the absolute evil. Is this really the predominant theme, with sprinkles of some critical thinking around it, or is it really a very nuanced narrative that you see?
Here the answer is a bit complex. The simple answer is they do see Israel as the absolute evil. For Islamists, Israel is the absolute evil, and it's an evil that there should be no compromise with. And their admiration for aspects of Zionism does not compromise this opinion. How so? Now, this goes deeper to the more general Islamist view, or at least mainstream Islamist view of the West. And Israel, in this sense, is simply an aspect of the West, a manifestation of the West in the Middle East. For Islamists, the West is an enemy, is a rival. But it is a rival that nevertheless succeeds. The fact is, which they do not deny, they don't attempt to deny, is that the West is doing much better. How so, and what are the implications? Let's say you are a 19th century Arab scholar, Islamist scholar.
I'm happy to be one. Yeah.
You'd have to be. These were interesting times. We have to agree. Late 19th century is probably the most interesting time in history.
Yeah, go.
And you observe that there is a civilization that is doing so much better than yours. Is the implication that the path of Islam is the wrong one? Is that the implication? Now, if you're an Islamist, of course, you cannot accept that. You cannot accept that the reason why the West is doing so well is that because it is Christian or because it is secular.
It's a test.
It's a great test. And they developed already from the late 19th century a point of view, a perception that was later adopted by Islamists and is also articulated by contemporary Islamists. And it says the following: the reason why the West is so successful is that the West is more Muslim than the Muslims. It is Muslim in a distorted way. It's not Muslim as it should be, but nevertheless it is Muslim. It is Muslim in its democracy. It is Muslim in its pursuit of sciences. It is Muslim in all these senses. We are lesser Muslims today. We have Muslim names, but we are not really Muslims. And this is what Islamists do.
How is democracy more Muslim than the form of government of Muslim countries? I would think that staunch Islamists would see it as an aberration from what religion is.
You would think, because they don't. They conceptualize, already since the late 19th century, they conceptualize democracy as something that is originally Islamic, that the West learned from Muslims, both theologically and historically, and that Muslims have neglected, and that's the reason for the dire state.
Is there any element of truth in that, historically?
No.
Okay.
Well, no, but historically is also a very debated thing.
Okay.
Maybe my history is not their history and your history is not theirs as well. Nevertheless, the approach to Israel is quite similar. You say, okay, Israel is doing so well because in some senses it is more Muslim than the Muslims. And therefore what we need to do to overcome Israel, if we ever wish to do so, is to learn from the Israelis that we really must go back to our Islamic roots. And that reconciles everything. Now we know why we lost the war. And now we are also certain, we can be reassured that we lost the war not because our ideology is wrong, but because our ideology is not applied.
So Israel, in a sense, is the absolute evil, as we said, and a role model at the same time.
Absolutely.
Is it also the case for the liberals? And here, I think it requires a bit of background. What exactly do you mean by liberals? Islamists is pretty straightforward, but liberals is not only the anti-religious elements in the Arab societies.
I define Arab liberals in a way which is probably narrower than most scholars would. But I say a liberal is someone who's not just for democracy, for human rights, because everyone in the Arab world is for democracy and human rights except, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's a conventional wisdom today. So who is a liberal? It is a person who, first and foremost, and almost exclusively cares about the democratization of Arab societies. For him or her, democratization is not a means to an end. It's not to promote Arab unity or socialism or Islam.
It's a value in
and of itself. That's number one. And number two, the liberal looks up to the example of the West and aims to imitate it. He or she don't try to contextualize it in Islamic terms, in Marxist terms, in any other terms than what this is. Simply to say, yes, there is a system of government and of values that developed in the West, and we like that system, and we want our states, our societies to also enjoy it. These are the liberals for me, and this is a very, very small group in the Arab world today.
So what is really the proportion in the Arab world, and how influential have they been, throughout the generations?
Take the example of the Egyptian elections, the ones and only that were true and real elections in which the Muslim Brothers won. How many liberals were elected to government? Almost none.
But by the way, if we're talking about Egypt, you wouldn't consider Abdel Fattah Sisi as either. It's certainly
absolutely
not an Islamist and not a liberal either.
He is an authoritarian, old-school president, and I don't think they're, other than his protégés. I've never met anyone who would say something different.
So the liberals in the Arab world have been really a very marginal elite, westernized elite
from a certain point in history. But remember that in the 20s and the 30s, they are the hegemonic group. Still an elite, but they dominate Arab politics in Egypt, in Syria, also elsewhere. So they are a marginalized group. They didn't start as such.
Okay, so let's take it now to their attitude towards Israel. Again, there's this dual approach to Israel as, the absolute enemy on the one hand and a role model on the other.
Yes, and we have to... That I think is something that characterizes all of them. But when we discuss liberal Arab views of Israel, we need to distinguish between actually two groups, the main group and the smaller one. The main group of Arab liberals are very staunch anti-Zionists. They think Zionism is wrong. They think that the state of Israel... they don't rule out compromise with the state of Israel. But when they try to explain why democracy is so important, they explain that it's absolutely essential for Arabs to democratize, or else they will not be able to stand another round of war with Israel.
So it is instrumental.
It's in and of itself, but I want to draw the comparison for the much smaller group of peace activists, liberal peace activists. They say that unless there is peace with Israel, there cannot be democracy. So it's basically the democracy is the objective for both. But this is a fine distinction. Do we approach our publics and try to promote democracy by saying, if there is no democracy, then there is no future for Arab states as independent states that are able to stand and resist the West and Israel? Or whether you say that unless there is peace with Israel, there is no democracy. But here are the sort of unfortunate news. The first group I mentioned is much, much more substantial.
In a way, it's a mirror image of the Israel debate in the West among, of course, a much bigger crowd of Democrats. Those who are pro-Israel and pro-Zionist to say that Israel is a force for the good in the world, and the others who say that Israel has actually betrayed the fundamentals of democracy by dispossessing the Palestinians and setting up an exclusively ethnic state. Is it really similar in the sense?
That's an interesting point you're making. I've never thought about it before, but I think in a sense there is this bigger debate whether democracy. When you are a liberal, there is a question: what's more important, independence or liberal values? If we can attain independence,
especially when you have neither,
especially when you have neither. But if we can attain independence, and that's a very big debate that dominated Arab liberal discourse in the 20s and 30s and reflected on Zionism. If we can attain independence, but the price is limiting freedoms, should we go for that? If we can have freedoms, freedom of the press, gender equality, so forth, but the price he's maintaining here English or French control for, let's say, 30 more years, is that a worthy price? The more people tend to think the latter, the more they would be more willing to reconcile with Zionism. Historically, and that's an interesting point.
Because they see Israel as the long arm of the West?
No, for a different reason, which is very pragmatic. Because they say, okay, we are not happy with Zionism. By the way, there's no single Arab who ever articulated happiness with Zionism or legitimized Zionism as a historical phenomenon. At least I've never read or met anyone who did that.
I'm sure that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could provide it.
I'm sure it could, but that would be very... today you have bloggers and so forth, but historically you cannot find a prominent, formidable scholar who was pro-Zionist, and I think it makes sense. But the reason was actually quite pragmatic for that group. It was simply saying, we need the support of England or France or today, let's say, the United States to achieve our objectives, our goals. The only way to do that is to make peace with Israel. And we need our societies not to be ruled by military chiefs and dictators. The only way to do that is to end hostilities with Israel.
Which is the logic that led Sadat to his peace overture with Israel in many ways.
But in also many different ways.
Yeah, sure. He wasn't neither a liberal nor a Democrat, for sure. But, the road to Washington goes through Jerusalem or Tel Aviv.
Well, what's very interesting is that this pragmatism, which I just mentioned, is so marginal in Arab societies. And I think when you analyze the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially during the past 20 years, I think the most interesting phenomenon is the fact that the clock goes backwards. Because look, in 1948, when you had Islamists and liberals and royalists and basically everyone marching to war with Israel, there were around 600,000 Jews here. And the military strength of the Arab forces, not just the sheer populations, but the military capabilities were far greater than those of the Zionists. So it made sense not to accept Zionism. Simply because you had good reason to believe that you can eliminate it. We are now fast forwarding almost 70 years. And it is in sheer strategic terms, it is simply not possible to have the state of Israel eliminated. And yet when you read Arab discourses, liberal, Islamist and other, eliminating Israel, I use this very terrible word because that is still a word which is used, is something that is still very much on the agenda. The idea that Israel would cease to exist is still something that characterizes Islamist writing about Israel and is not entirely not there in liberal writings of the more mainstream liberal wing. And it makes you wonder, how is that possible? Because we're discussing two groups that are really the more extreme in the views, rather than You say more extreme than that you'd have to define what mainstream is.
No,
because
so I'm talking about the mainstream authoritarian.
But when you had elections in Egypt, those groups won 75% of the vote. When you had elections in the Palestinian Authority, the first and last, these groups won a majority. When you had elections in Tunisia, these groups won a majority. Everywhere other than Libya, these groups won a majority. And as I mentioned, the liberals are not very different in their view. It's very difficult to find an Arab who would psychologically, but also in writing, say in 50, 60 years, there's going to be a state of Israel. And trying to figure out how come. How is that possible? I mean, several ideas come to mind, but the first and foremost is demography. And in 1948, there were 600,000 Jews compared to 40 million Arabs. And today, yes, there are 6 million Jews, but they're surrounded by 300 million Arabs. And if you're one of those 300 million Arabs, you are bound to think that 300 million people will eventually find a way to get it their way when they struggle with a small minority of 6 million in an ocean of hostile Arabs. But there is another reason, and this one pertains only to the Islamists. From the Islamist point of view, they never lost a war with Israel. It wasn't real Muslims.
Fought it. Yeah.
Well, 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, they were not in power. In the few occasions where they were actually fighting Israelis in Gaza and in Lebanon, they think they won. And I have to say, when you look at the balance of power, in a sense, they're not entirely wrong. Because 5,000 Hamas commanders and not a much bigger number of Hezbollah fighters did force Israel to withdraw from territories that it did not originally intend to withdraw from. So from the Islamist point of view, they have a good reason to think, well, if this is what we managed to do with our forces only in Gaza and Lebanon, think what we will manage to do if the entire Arab world would be Islamist. So just give us the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, we're quickly running out of time, so I'll just ask you one last question, and that is how the Arab Spring revolutions change anything, if at all?
it's a big question whether we can discuss the Arab Spring as a whole, because what happened in Tunisia is very different to what happened in Egypt. But let's just focus on Egypt, with your permission.
Sure.
And in Egypt, in a way, Israel was lucky. A stable Muslim Brothers government would have ultimately led to an end of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. There could not be any other way. And today things are back to normal in a very abnormal way. You have President Sisi, who is, when it comes to Israel, nothing but an extension of Mubarak's age. And from at least short-term Israeli point of view, these are good news. But if you are a person who really believes that there is reason why democracies don't fight one another, and that the future of the Arab world really depends on democratization, a better future for the Arab world, then these are not good news.
Right. Okay. Professor Uriya Shavit, Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University and co-author of the newly published Zionism in Arab Discourses. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Pleasure being here.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
הרוח הקרה שתבוא, עד מחר תראי איך שהכל יעבור. מאמי לא מצאתי מקום, וכמה זה חשוב לנו השקט היום.